We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Jen Marlowe and Holly Ballard. Jen Marlowe is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, author, playwright, and human rights activist. She is the co-director of A Life in the Balance, examining the Troy Davis case, a 4-part video series for Amnesty International. She's also the author of the new book, I Am Troy Davis, co-authored with Troy's sister, Martina Davis Correa. Holly Ballard is the outreach coordinator of Washington Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. Jen and Holly, thank you both for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks for having us on, Mike.
Thanks so much, Mike.
So let's start out with you, Holly. Tell us about the Washington Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty.
So we started in 1986, and we are, as evidenced by our name, a coalition to abolish the death penalty. It's a part of a statewide legislative effort called the Safe and Just Alternatives Campaign to replace the death penalty with life without parole. And we do have actually lawmakers in all 4 caucuses that have supported death penalty repeal. So we are well on our way to seeing this legislative effort go forward. We are concerned primarily for a number of reasons about the death penalty, including the fact that it's a staggering cost to taxpayers. So a 2006 Washington State Bar study estimated that the death penalty cases cost on average an additional $800,000 per case. And taxpayers are out nearly $7 million on the 2007 Carnation case alone, which has yet to even go to trial. We're also concerned about innocence. 142 people have been exonerated from death rows across the country since 1973. And so that really makes you wonder how many more we've missed. Death penalty obviously is irreversible, and so there's a serious concern about that, as well as fairness. The death penalty is really arbitrarily applied across the spectrum, from socioeconomic backgrounds to people of color, and even to the county in which the crime happens. So Pierce County actually seeks the death penalty twice as often as King County, even for similar crimes, because of the lack of resources in King County and other counties across the state that just can't afford to seek the death penalty. So the idea that the death penalty is reserved for, quote, the worst of the worst is really an erroneous idea, because the fact is the resources just aren't there across the state. And this is sort of symptomatic of trends nationwide.
All right. And Jen, what was your motivation in writing your new book, I Am Troy Davis? How did you get involved in that?
Well, the motivation came from my growing relationship with Troy Davis and with his family. And that began, Troy, by the time the state of Georgia finally succeeded in executing Troy, which was on September 21st, 2011, that had actually been their 4th attempt. The first time they tried to kill Troy, his first execution date was in July 2007, and he survived that execution date by 23 hours. And the day after that, I heard his sister Martina speak on Democracy Now!, and I heard Martina talking about her fight to prove her brother's innocence, and also the double struggle that she was fighting for her own life. She was diagnosed with terminal breast cancer 6 years before that, so she'd been fighting for her own life at the same time that she was fighting for her brother's life. And she was so clearly a force of nature. It made me curious about this brother whose innocence she was fighting to prove. I hadn't heard anything about Troy's case at that point, and I began to do research online. I quickly uncovered the report that Amnesty International had put out a few months earlier, which was put out in February 2007, called Where is the Justice for Me? And all the facts about Troy's case were just laid out in empirical black and white. The fact that there was never any physical evidence that linked him to the murder of the police officer for which he had been convicted and sentenced to death. The fact that the only evidence used against him were eyewitness testimony, and that 7 out of the 9 key witnesses later recanted their testimony, many saying that they had been coerced and intimidated by the police into implicating Troy. So it seems so clearly a travesty of justice. And I just found a website with Troy's address in prison in that research, and I wrote him a card, and we began a correspondence. He actually suggested to me that I make a documentary film about his sister Martina when he learned I was a filmmaker. And then when I met Martina, she came to Seattle in 2009 for a speaking event, Martina actually was the one who mentioned, she said, people keep telling me that I should write a book, but I would need someone to work with me on it because I don't have time to write a book myself. And I couldn't get the idea out of my mind, partly because Troy had already planted that seed when he had suggested that I make a film about Martina. And at that point, Troy and I had already been corresponding for a couple of years, and we'd started talking on the phone, and I was getting closer to him, and I wanted to do whatever I could to help him get free, and to help expose his case. So I asked Martina if she would want me to be that person to work with her on the project, and she said yes, and we began.
And you actually ended up meeting him in person a couple times.
Several times. So the first time I met Troy was soon after Martina and I made the decision to work on the book together. I made my first of many trips to Savannah, and I went with Martina and the entire Davis family to visit Troy on Georgia's death row, and that was my first visit. And it was a really profound experience. You go to Georgia's death row, you go to any maximum security prison, and you're surrounded with concrete and barbed wire and guard towers, and it's pretty extraordinary when you're sitting in the midst of that, and to see the Davis family transform that into warmth and love and humanity. Troy's humanity was so clear, his dignity, his love for his family, the family's faith, their devotion to each other. It was able to transform concrete and barbed wire. And Troy and I actually, during that first visit, we devised a system where he too could contribute to the book. And so there's a lot of the book that comes directly from Troy. We devised a system through letters and through phone calls, where I would, because the authorities in the prison system in Georgia would have created trouble for Troy if they knew he was working on writing a book. And so we devised a system where in every letter I wrote him, I would just plant a question or two that Troy would understand was for the book. So I would write him a letter. I'd say, "Wow, Troy, I'd love to hear about some of your earliest childhood memories." And then he would write me pages and pages of those memories with the understanding that that would be used in the book. And so I was able to visit Troy many times, and we became closer and closer. And actually, the last time I visited Troy was the day before his execution. He was able to put a list of, I think it's around 20 people who are permitted to go and say goodbye. It's, there's so many things about this scripted process of state killing that's so barbaric, and the idea that you have to come up with your list of people that are going to come and say goodbye to you. So I was able to go and be one of the people to say goodbye to Troy the day before the state of Georgia ultimately killed him.
In your emails to me, you called this the death penalty system. Can you talk about how this system impacted Troy's family and other families?
Absolutely. There are so many invisible victims of the death penalty system that we're not accustomed to thinking about. I think we're accustomed to thinking about the condemned prisoner himself, and there's a lot of attention that's often put on what was his last meal request and what were his or her last words, but we don't think of the innocent families that get ground up in this death penalty system, which of course includes the family of the condemned prisoner. So Troy's family has paid an enormous price of suffering due to the fact that their decades-long struggle to try to save Troy, and the fact that death and dying were constantly hanging over their heads. Troy's death and dying. But there's also the families of the murder victims, who many of whom have spoken out and talked about how the death penalty not only doesn't meet their needs, but in many ways the death penalty prolongs their trauma and prolongs their pain, because the case gets dragged out for years and years, often for decades, because resources that could be spent on victim services, resources that could be spent really helping families, are instead spent on the death penalty. So there's many, many family members of murder victims who have stood up to say, we don't want the death penalty. It hurts us. It doesn't help us. And other invisible victims are the state employees, our government employees who are tasked with the job of killing prisoners. We often don't think about the executioners themselves and the ones who have reported having nightmares where the people that they have executed are gathered around their bed, or people after we've heard of wardens talk after an execution that they're staying up all night vomiting. It is deepening and extending trauma all around, and it's not solving anything. The death penalty doesn't make communities safer. It is not a deterrent. Studies have shown that. The death penalty, the only need it possibly answers is sort of a visceral need for vengeance. And I don't believe a justice system should be rooted in, a visceral need for revenge. I mean, not for justice, a visceral need for retaliation and revenge. I think a justice system should not be based on this visceral need for revenge. I think a justice system should be based on meeting community needs and making a community safer and stronger, and the death penalty detracts from that.
And as you mentioned, the both Troy and the family having to go through 4 basically stays.
There was 4 different execution dates. So Troy's family had to prepare to say goodbye to him 4 different times. In 2007, which was the first execution date, that execution was stayed 23 hours in advance. His second execution date, which was September 2008, that execution came within 90 minutes of its scheduled time. So Troy's family had already said goodbye to him. They were in the prison yard holding vigil, waiting to see if this execution was going to proceed. His third execution date got stayed 3 days in advance. And then the fourth execution date was when they were ultimately successful. Troy's mother ended up passing away just months before the fourth execution date, the ultimate execution. And she passed away, it was exactly 2 weeks after the U.S. Supreme Court had denied Troy's final appeal, which was what paved the way for the state of Georgia to set that final execution date. Virginia Davis had gone to the doctor the day before that, had been given a clean bill of health. And the next day, her grandson, Troy's nephew, Martina's son Dejan, came home. Couldn't wake Grandma up. She had keeled over in her chair. The doctors doing a preliminary autopsy found no discernible cause of death, no signs of heart attack, no signs of stroke. Her death certificate said natural causes, but Martina came out and said there's nothing natural about dying of heartbreak because you can't endure your son's fourth execution date. So that, again, that's part of what I mean when I talk about the price that the death penalty wreaks on innocent families.
Holly, can you talk about that a bit more? I believe on your website you have former wardens that are against the death penalty.
We do. We have a couple of individuals who have either previously or are currently involved in working in the justice system. Norm Stamper and Dick Morgan have both come out in opposition to the death penalty. The toll that it takes on, as Jen mentioned, the officials, on the families of murder victims is just tremendous. And I think ultimately there are so many staggering reasons to repeal the death penalty that the ultimate reason of vengeance is just not, it's not that it's not relevant or it doesn't have merit. I mean, for some people, I think for victims of these horrible crimes, their need for justice is real. And there's never a time when we look at a horrific crime and say, oh, well, it's not a big deal, or that we're discounting the pain. But as Jen mentioned, it turns out that the death penalty often prolongs that pain for victims' family members. And so many of them are part of our coalition to say we need to repeal the death penalty because this policy is not working for us. And ultimately, it's not, justice should be swift and it should be sure, and the death penalty is neither. It takes many years if somebody's ever executed at all. And the toll that takes on, again, the prison officials, the family members of both the condemned prisoner and the victims' families is just really tremendously outweighs any sort of value, I think, in retributive justice. We could much easier put someone in prison with life without parole, save millions of extra dollars that could be going into other justice programs, that could be going into victims' family services. For example, King County just last year closed our cold case unit at the end of 2012 for lack of funding. So there are all of these family members that are still sitting around hoping to know what happened to their loved ones, and they may never find out. And if we could reroute this funding that we are wasting on the death penalty, an ineffectual policy that, as Jen mentioned, is not a deterrent. We know that, in fact, violent crime rates and homicide rates are actually higher in states that have the death penalty than states that don't. So we could reroute those funds into services that make more sense for an overall more just society, as opposed to continuing to push forward with an ineffectual policy that is just not working for Washington's taxpayers. It's not working for Washington's victims' families. It's not working for folks in the system, and it's not certainly working for folks that are on death row.
And sticking with the Troy Davis's case, Jen, you had mentioned 7 of 9 of the witnesses recanted. Did that happen while he was still alive? And was there an alternate suspect in this case?
The 7 of the witnesses who recanted, yes, that was still while Troy was alive, and many other witnesses came forth and implicated another man. And in fact, the man who has been named by many other witnesses is one of the 2 witnesses who did not recant. And he is the man, he and Troy were both at the scene of the crime when police officer Mark McPhail was murdered, and this other man, Sylvester Red Coles, is the one who went to the police the next day and gave them Troy Davis's name. And from that point on, the investigation had tunnel vision on Troy and on Troy alone. And so this other man, Sylvester Red Coles, was never investigated as a suspect, even though it later emerged that he was seen carrying with him the very same caliber of gun that had been used in the murder of Officer McPhail, and that other witnesses later said that Coles had confessed to them. And several other witnesses came forward and said they actually had witnessed this man Coles pull the trigger. But I think one of the things that Troy's case exposes about our justice system is that it often is not actually concerned about truth. It's concerned about procedure and process. It prioritizes finality over fairness. So by the time these recantations came forward and these new testimonies came forward, Troy had already missed critical windows in his habeas process, in his appeals process, and it was considered too late. So the idea that Troy had serious claims of innocence was just dismissed because the focus was, time after time, appeal after appeal, the focus was on procedure and process, not on fairness and truth. Troy eventually did get an evidentiary hearing. The U.S. Supreme Court finally did order that in 2009, and the hearing happened in 2010. But the standards of that hearing were enormously high. People talk about how our justice system is that you're innocent until proven guilty, but once convicted, and Troy was convicted in 1991, that burden of proof shifted. So it was on Troy to prove innocence. He had to prove innocence, and that's an enormously challenging legal standard, because 20 years after trial, when some witnesses have died, other witness memories have gone stale, there was never any physical evidence, so there's nothing for DNA to conclusively scientifically prove in Troy's case, and that's true in many other murder cases. DNA is just the tip of the iceberg, and in terms of being able to prove innocence. So how in those circumstances, how do you prove a negative? How do you prove innocence? And the federal judge that was appointed to Troy's case determined that Troy did not prove innocence. He did admit in his ruling that the case against Troy was not ironclad, yet he said that Troy did not prove innocence. Even though when you look at the evidence that had been used against Troy at trial, whatever flimsy case there was against Troy at trial, it had all unraveled by then. Yet the judge determined that was not proving innocence.
And I should mention that as we're talking about appeals, a lot of folks, when we talk about the cost of the death penalty, think, and I used to think actually, that the appeals process is where the majority of those costs come from. But that's not actually true. So as Jen mentioned, by the time that someone has gotten through their first trial and has gone usually to their habeas appeal, and then as they move forward through the system, ultimately with Troy ending up at the U.S. Supreme Court, those costs are there, but so much of the costs actually come in the pretrial and then the original trial phases. And that's because the standard has to be, it's necessarily higher in death penalty cases than in non-death penalty cases to make sure that we don't make a mistake. But as I mentioned, 142 people have been executed from death row in the United States since 1973. So those are just the cases that we know about where we got it wrong and were able to release those people from death row before they were executed. But we had this tremendous, a friend of mine likes to say frequently that the system itself with the laws actually should work, but we have human beings operating a system and therefore is erroneous in the sense that many times they feel that from the police to the prosecutors feel pressure to put someone in prison to get sort of to look tough on crime and to make the people in the communities feel safer. And so what we end up with is oftentimes sort of, if not completely invented, then sort of certainly twisted evidence in an original trial. And as many safeguards as there are within the justice system, we still get it wrong. But we certainly can't sort of streamline that system because then we run the risk of getting it wrong even more often.
Right. And they're trying to streamline it right now in Florida. In Florida, there's legislation that's being debated called the Timely Justice Act, which is basically an attempt to fast track the death penalty. And like Holly's mentioned, there's 142 people we've exonerated from death row. How many of them would have ended up actually being executed, being exonerated posthumously if a fast-track system had been in place? We know we've executed innocent people in this country. Troy is just one of many innocent people that we have executed, and any attempt to fast-track the process will only guarantee that we will execute even more innocent people than we are already at risk of.
And so if we know that that's the case, then the only logical alternative is to repeal the death penalty. We can't streamline the process without risking innocent lives, and we can't afford to continue to spend millions of extra dollars on a system that doesn't work.
Freddie Lee Pitts is one of those 142 men who have been exonerated from death row, and Freddie Lee Pitts once said, you can always release a wrongfully convicted man from prison. You can never release him from the grave.
Just about 7 minutes left. I want to make sure we get to you, Jen, with the actual reading. How many people are currently on death row in the U.S.? Do we know?
Well, here in Washington State, I believe there's 9.
There are 9, and I should mention that 4 of those are African Americans. That's just a quick snapshot into the racial disparity that we see not only in Washington but across the country.
And I don't know the statistic nationwide. I would have to look that up. But of course, California is the largest death row in the country. I think something like 20% of all death row inmates in the United States are in California. And you look at the other big executing states such as Texas, Virginia. There's a lot of people on the row with their life on the line.
In fact, a study just came out recently that showed that the majority of executions in the country are conducted or sought at least in 2% of counties. So again, that's a reminder that it really depends on the resources of each county to determine whether they will seek the death penalty, and that really is overrepresented in places, I think, like California and Texas.
And it sounds like also the politics that decide where the death penalty is being carried out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Jen, can you read us a segment from your book, I Am Troy Davis?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And this segment actually is from July 16th, 2007, which was supposed to be Troy's first execution date. It was the first execution date. The execution was ultimately avoided, and this passage takes place when the family is waiting to hear what decision the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Parole made in terms of Troy's clemency hearing. An unfamiliar number appeared on Martina's caller ID at 8 p.m. Hello? Martina? Yes? This is the New York Times. How do you feel? How do I feel about what? About Troy's stay. What stay? The parole board gave Troy a 90-day stay of execution. Martina threw the phone down and began to leap around the hotel room. Troy got a stay! Troy got a stay! She screamed. Just then, Mama's cell phone rang. Virginia punched through the numbers as quickly as she could so that she could hear Troy's voice. Hi, Mama. How'd the hearing go? Virginia put her cell phone on speaker so Troy could hear Martina, who was still dancing and singing ebulliently. You hear that, honey? The family huddled around Virginia's cell phone to hear Troy's reaction. For a moment, there was silence. Then, an almost inaudible, "Thank you, God," followed by another, "Thank you, God," this time a little louder. Troy did something that he did regularly. Troy prayed. Then he did something he almost never did. Troy began to cry. Warden Terry verified the news of the stay, and 2 guards led Troy from the death house back to his cell block. Fellow death row inmates lined up at the doors of their cells, extending their arms through the iron bars to grasp Troy's hand as he walked down the row. "Praise God, brother," one man called out to him, tears in his eyes. "Maybe at least one of us will survive this place," another cheered. Troy's friends shoved small items through the bars for him to take back, items that Troy had bequeathed to them the previous day. A bottle of shampoo, some extra stamps, a few envelopes, his belt and shoes. Troy, head high and a new spring in his step, walked into his cell. He heard the familiar clank of the cell door locking behind him, but at that moment he was not focused on his confinement. He was focused on his life. Georgia had intended to take it from him in less than 24 hours. He and his family and scores of supporters had fought, and they had prevailed. And although, the fight to save Troy's life, we ultimately lost that battle. Troy was executed. But that sense of the fight prevailing, we've made a lot of successes in this effort to bring down the death penalty in the last 2 years, and I think that a lot of that is because of Troy and because of how deeply disturbed people were when they saw that state governments were so comfortable proceeding with an execution when there was a mountain of evidence pointing to the person's innocence. Since Troy's execution, 2 more states have abolished the death penalty, Connecticut and Maryland. Actually, Maryland just signed that into law on October 1st, a few days ago. U.S. support for the death penalty. Gallup has shown that weeks following Troy's execution, Gallup did a poll. They showed that was at a 39-year low, U.S. support for the death penalty. A lot of progress has been made, and we have a lot of work to still to do right here in Washington State.
That's right, Jen. So we're in a really fortunate situation, thanks so much to the work that folks have done on cases like Troy's, where we are in a situation of national momentum. Support for the death penalty is at an all-time low, including here in Washington. People just don't support this policy anymore for all the reasons that we've talked about. So last year, just to give you a quick update on what's been happening with this legislation, we are trying to do this as a legislative campaign. In 2012, there was a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then last year we had a hearing in the House Judiciary Committee. So we're making really incremental progress toward getting a bill up for a vote, which is great. I mean, I think we are continuing to get more support every year, and the legislators are feeling more and more confident that their constituents care about this issue and do want to see the death penalty repealed. And so I have some great news for you guys, which is there is a lot you can do out there when you're listening to help. Today actually kicks off our first ever week of action against the death penalty. This is a little longer than a week. It's 9 days of events across the state. A lot of them are taking place here in Seattle. I wanted to mention a couple of those for you. October 10th is actually World Day to Abolish the Death Penalty, and you guys can support repeal right now, right from home, by participating in our Thunderclap. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a coordinated social media tool that automatically publishes a message about repeal to your Facebook or Twitter. But we do need 100 people in order for the Thunderclap to go out. So I think right now we're at about 40% of that. So all of you guys listening out there, please take a moment to log on to our website. We'll mention this again at the end of the show, but it's abolishdeathpenalty.org, and click on our October updates, or you can visit our Facebook, which is WCADP, or Twitter at WA_abolish. You can also actually sign up to be a member or sign up to volunteer on our website as well. So those are a couple of really quick and simple things that you can do. And then we do have a couple of events that I wanted to highlight out of the many events that are taking place over the next few days. There will be multiple speaking events with Jason Baldwin of the West Memphis 3. The first of those is tomorrow morning in Bellevue at East Shore Unitarian Church at 9:30 in the morning. There is also a screening of the Central Park 5 movie as part of the Seattle Social Justice Film Festival. That's on the 12th at the University Christian Church in the U District, and that's going to be followed by a talk with Sister Helen Prejean, who you guys might know from the Dead Man Walking book and film. And then also we're bringing in Delbert Tibbs, who is an exoneree from Witness to Innocence. He was exonerated in Chicago in the early 80s, and he will be keynoting our annual meeting at the Auburn Parks and Rec Administration building on October 13th, as well as doing a couple of other engagements throughout the state.
All right.
And actually, the short film that I made with Amnesty International, A Life in the Balance, examining the Troy Davis case, is also screening at the Seattle Social Justice Film Festival on Friday. And Laura Moy will be here with the film. She led Troy's campaign for Amnesty International as the death penalty abolition campaign director.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you both for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for
Thank
having
you.
us, Mike.
Really appreciate it.